Imagine, if you will, a chicken. Now imagine that it, the chicken that is wearing a hat. Not any hat, but as my 5-year-old once told me, during one of those amusing but also perfectly idyllic family-oriented scenarios that Google encourages its employees to invoke in their anecdotes, not any hat, but one of those Instagram hats from the mouths of babes. Story number 2. When I was a boy, I used to dream about space travel. The moon landing, the SETI project, Star Trek. One day, the great Steve Jobs and I were in China, and the great man, Requiescat in Pace, told me just before he died that the current educational situation was desperately outmoded, desperately unsuited to our times. He went on to say that the task of education was to bring energy to innovation. That's why tonight, I'm going to talk to you about what I like to call educational innovation as the key to expanding our creative future. What? You mean this isn't actually a TED Talk? Well, who the fuck are all these people? How much did we charge them? You're saying there's no one here from Google? Not even that guy. Jesus Christ. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bryan Cooke. I am, by grace of God, convener of the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. And I'd like to welcome you all tonight for the official launch of A.J. Bartlett and Justin Clemens et al.'s incredibly important new book, What is Education? I'm not actually going to introduce this wholly remarkable book. That will be the task of the wonderful Dr. Whyte, who I will be inviting to join me up here relatively soon. Now, this order of proceeding might make you think that, like a lot of people who come on stage first and announce some kind of institutional affiliation, that my role seems sort of redundant. Like I have the sort of gig usually reserved for that ruling class of overpaid platitude monger who gets to authorize pay rises for themselves when anything goes within 50-kilometer radius of their most extendable appendage, but who also get to sack people when things go badly. So, in order to offset this sense of being supererogatory, I'm going to take a moment to inform you that I've recently accepted a position as Education Undersecretary in the CIII. That's the Center for Innovation in Innovation. The CIII is positioned to take on a leading role in our own city of ideas and will be disseminating our values all over this great city in the near and long-term future. So tonight, on behalf of this new initiative in innovation, I'd like to use my remaining time to give you good people of Melbourne some warning about the kind of thing that might be said here tonight. Bartlett and Clemens, if that's even their real names, are philosophical types. But aren't we all philosophers in our own way? And so when, in this book, B and C raise the topic of education, they turn it into a whole big philosophical question that you have to think really hard to make sense of. From the opening pages of the book, they come over all adjectives aren't really the same as arguments. You can't just coin a neologism, hypostasize it, and then treat it like it has causal force in the world while appending a bunch of positive connotations and obscuring the fact that the term lacks anything resembling an actual denotation and call it a concept. They also make these really provocative claims that education is everywhere invoked, simultaneously celebrated, and denounced as going under perpetual crisis, despite the fact that no one ever asks the question of what it actually is, what it is for, why it is good, or how we might measure the kind of answers that are given to these questions, given that they tend to arise from the received wisdom of a society that these same educational discourses also purport ad nauseum to disrupt and to transform. Our authors imply that the various competing discourses of education have coalesced into a kind of neoliberal stasis whose culture war, frenzy, and noise pollution hides a sort of constitutive blind spot where the fundamental educational questions of transmission, the subject, and transformation are occluded, while being invoked, so as to cover over the way in which such questions prove recalcitrant to what passes itself today as knowledge. Now, against this sort of thing, I'd like to take the opportunity to say that, in fact, there definitely isn't a continually covered over lacuna in the dominant discourses of education, which cannot be exposed without raising difficult philosophical questions about the universal singular. Pace, Bartlett, and Clemens, and their co-conspirators, I think we all know that the latest research, all the journal articles and mission statements give a perfectly clear and completely unequivocal definition of what education is, which I assume you want to hear. Education is what allows us, and by us I mean humanity in all its rich diversity and the iridescent flows of our mutable identities in an ever-changing societal landscape. Education is what allows us to simultaneously dodge and embrace the future. No, actually, no one at the cutting edge of educational reform does know what a mixed metaphor is. That sort of thing is lost knowledge, like Etruscan and the bits of the history of philosophy that libertarians don't like. Okay, but if education is about ducking the future and running towards it with open arms, one obvious question is, what's the future exactly? Well, obviously we don't really know, it hasn't happened, but we do know that it's coming and we need to be ready for it. Now, there are people who do know what the future is going to be like. They're called futurologists, and they get to host the most expensive TED Talks. But here, on the cutting edge of educational thought, by the way, when I use that phrase, I don't want you to think about knives. That would be creepy. Try to think about, I don't know, Einstein and really cool graphic designers or something. Here on the cutting edge of educational thought, if there's one thing we know, it's that we are definitely on the side of the future. And the future, my friends, is coming. It's like it's inevitable or something. But what most people don't know is that for some people, the future's already here. We like to call these people visionaries. Visionaries aren't just people who can see, common mistake. We call these people seers or seers. Visionaries are people who can live in the future before it's the future, so that when it's actually the future, they can be all like, the future. I've been here for ages and it's kind of boring now because I kind of like invented this, yeah? But when we listen to the right people, not teachers, obviously, no one gives a shit about them, but to the people I like to call thought leaders, sounds better in German, these special guys and girls don't just offer us visions, they actually manage to lead all of us, not that we're sheep, to the places that only minds who have been specially trained in evidence-based innovation can see, but which still definitely exist. It's a selfless task being a sort of Moses for the future. I don't mean to culturally appropriate, but it's not irrationally altruistic. If you can lead people into the future using only your own brain and enough money to provide clean water for all of Africa, you can also achieve something that medieval and Renaissance alchemists tried a sort of crap version of for millennia. That is, you can take a lot of money and turn it into even more money. If you can turn money into money, then you are already hugging the future and escaping it at the same time. This means that you are like a ninja, but also like a teddy bear. And if you can be both of these things at the same time, it's pretty obvious what the rewards are. You get to own democracy. You can take the world system and play with it like a bouncy, chocolate-covered masturbation aid with a Pokemon logo. Not only that, but people will give you awards rather than prison time when you say that you've just thought of which countries to bomb back into the Stone Age. Okay. So at this point, you might be wondering, why is it so important that we both dodge and embrace the future at the same time? Well, one of the other things we know about the future is that it comes at you like fast. As a wise person, probably Vin Diesel or Dumbledore said, in this world, there's the quick and the dead. But I don't mean that in that sort of off-brand biblical sense of the phrase where quick apparently means something other than fast. That's just confusing. There are the literally quick and the literally dead, and clearly the point is that people who are dead because they weren't quick enough. That's the takeaway. Aesop's fable about the hare and the tortoise should have started with the tortoise being taken out in a drone strike from the future. As bits of flying turtle meat soar up into the air and descend in a Poisson distribution all over the ancient athletics track, the properly educated Hare yells out, "Learn to innovate." Put differently, what I'm saying, what my own CEO is saying, is that if we're to, as it were, propitiate the gargantuan tentacled elder abomination of the future, we have to learn to adapt to the ever-changing environment of the present. What are the causes of rapid environmental change? Well, some people say it has something to do with a kind of governmental machine that operates on the ostensibly free actions of creatures to create a world where all that is solid melts into air, except, of course, for the growing power of a rapacious plutocracy. But that answer's actually wrong. The cause of environmental change is, of course, freedom. Yes, it's also terrorism, the fact that people get bored with their old haircuts, technology, and the farcical arbitrariness of the global financial system. But these are just artifacts of freedom. If the environment's got a tendency to take something solid, skip the melting stage, and go straight to the point where it's now a portion of a toxic, unbreathable atmosphere, then we need new virtues for a new world. Along with adaptability, these virtues are resilience and agility. I've already spoken about agility, but resilience means that when we can't duck the future by being agile, we also know how not to die when we inevitably get hit in the face by it. There's a lot of ways that the future can hit us: war, unemployment, debt, displacement, cessation of social services, isolation, corruption, abandonment to the exceptional foundation of the law, and that admixture of psychical and physical trauma that tends to be the concomitants of being what I like to call the not quite winners in life's competition. Yes, saying that we need to be resilient in this way does imply that in the future, a lot of people are going to be hit by a lot of things, and that the best they can do is get used to it. All our projections confirm this. But we've also worked out that the people who are going to be hit the least will be the rich, I mean the educated. Education isn't just about allowing middle-class people to find ways to feel good about becoming ever more middle class. It doesn't just allow you to fulfill the dream of being the only hot person in the nursing home or having an Instagram account that will be the envy of people you used to envy. It doesn't just mean that one day you'll have preternaturally photogenic children who will cavort and look ruffled and sexy in video documents of their lives that will resemble a lifetime-long installment of the later Fast and the Furious movies. No, being resilient, adaptable, and agile through innovative education will offer a way to let you and your children escape the total destruction of the planet in a great, big, shiny thing that our Department of Pleonasm and Redundancy has called the Thought Leader's Space Ark in Space. Right, so now we know what education is and what education is for. But Bartlett, Clemens, and Whyte are probably going to try to persuade you of other confusing things. They'll probably say that everything I've said so far is bollocks with prepositions. Who's right and who's wrong, you decide, but the correct answer is me. I'm right, definitely. That's why I want to appeal to those of you gathered here tonight. We know we're both of the right generations to know that while most of history was a nightmare from which we're still trying to wake, we have also been educated to realize that a series of absolutely objectively true ideas about education, as well as politics, sex, language, metaphysics, psychology, and economics, were comprehensively worked out in a few seminal, it means like semen, papers written between 1970 and 1996. We know what the good is, we know what education is, we know what justice is, and we take evidence-based cues from the world about how we can all be our best selves. In contrast to this, Bartlett and Clemens and their foreign accomplices are, well, I'm not saying that they're well poisoners, but they do definitely poison a lot of wells. For example, they criticize what they call the positivist model of education as simply thinking that education is a matter of the transmission of information, and mock the likes of Cardinal Newman and Matthew Arnold, who they suggest promote a sentimental and obscurantist notion of education artificially separated from any question of the historical role education has played in social reproduction. At the same time, however, B and C also seem to be asserting that the various forms of critical pedagogy emanating from the new sociology of figures like Pierre Bourdieu has actually been completely co-opted by the contemporary neoliberal paradigm of education, such that what was once a radical critique of education is today simply a vehicle for the perpetuation and legitimation of pre-existing social inequalities. despite the fact that this discourse preens itself on being specially armed to see through this mode of social reproduction. Between positivism and sociology, however, our present system of education, neoliberal education, absorbs endless energy in addressing its own crisis while ignoring, Bartlett and Clemens say, the possibility of an education that is devoted to anything other than selling ostensible technologies of adaptation to the whims of the global market. Now, if academic etiquette has taught me anything, it's that you really can't say this sort of thing. If bureaucrats have been quoting Bourdieu for 40 years on the topic of educational institutions as places where existing social inequalities are ratified, then that cannot have failed to produce a society that grows ever more egalitarian. Reality, Pace, Adorno, cannot be as dialectical as all that. Thus, as we at the CII, I often like to say, today we have a choice between invention and convention. But Bartlett and Clemens are the kind of guys who would say that if you keep asking people whether they prefer invention or convention, and everyone keeps saying, yay, invention, then the meaningless mere invocation of invention is actually just an insipid convention that has failed to ask the question of what real change means in a situation where change is at once a constant and the undefined slogan of everything from the Trump administration to the Coca-Cola Corporation. Like I said, Bartlett and Clemens, they're probably just trying to distract you so that you give up your freedoms. As a final point, you'll notice with appropriate suspicion that Bartlett in particular spends quite a lot of time talking about Plato. Now, Plato is the kind of person people used to talk about a long time before we first properly understood education in 1995. Plato comes from the olden days when hardly anyone talked about innovation, and thus when nothing new ever happened and no one really knew anything. See what I did there with new and new? Also, we all know that if we talk about the past, the future will be exactly like the past. That's how history works. Take, for example, the Victorians. For a long time, the word Victorian has been a sort of synecdoche for hypocrisy, for a society who thought that their own self-important codes of etiquette and an intense hand-wringing about personal morality somehow made up for the fact that they lived in societies based on the criminal dispossession of the vast majority of human beings and the expropriation of all their stuff. I can see no analogies whatsoever between such a period and our own time. And in any case, all educated people know that people never make a big fuss about the ways that they're different from something to which they're in fact very similar. If that were the case, there'd be a phrase for it, something like the self-aggrandizement of the minor distinction. It's a ridiculous comparison. We have the internet now, and we think that sex is all right, so I think we can all forget about any implications that we didn't reach peak virtue around the time of the invention of the retweet. In any case, I've gone on for long enough, and I've tried to warn you. I think you should leave, but if you're into that kind of deeply morally ambiguous and confusing stuff that I've been talking about, I'm not going to kink shame you. The MSCP takes a very firm stance against kink shaming, even though I happen to like it so much that it's actually one of my personal kinks. No one should tell other people to be ashamed of what they get off on, even if psychoanalysis occasionally implies that we can actually get off on being ashamed of what we get off on not getting off, on telling people not to tell other people to be ashamed about what they get off on, and even by making a game for themselves where they try to use the phrase to get off on as many times as possible in the same sentence. On that particularly innovative note, I'd like finally to introduce the real portion of this evening's proceedings. Dr. Jessica Whyte is a senior lecturer in cultural and social analysis at the University of Western Sydney and the author of an extraordinary book, Catastrophe and Redemption, that consists in an introduction to and critique of Georgia Agamben's political thought. For some years now, she's been working on a painstaking reconstruction and critique of post-war social and political thought, particularly related to attempts to abolish politics in the name of moralism, legalism, and the replacement of radical universalism with economic forms of global governance. Jess is a searing intellect, a savage critic, an angelically assiduous researcher into the foundations of our hegemonic sophistries, and the most eloquent podcast guest ever to have graced Philosophy Can Ruin Your Life. I constantly, in Jess's tell other people that Jess is my friend in order to get vicarious glory. No one so far has believed me. Do so tonight. Please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Jessica Whyte.
Thank you, Brian. And after that very compelling critique of this book, I feel like I should give people a moment in case they'd like to leave before we begin. So if anyone would like to walk out. Okay, so for those of you who are still here, first I just want to say that I'm extremely pleased to have been invited to launch this book. It's a fantastic book, and really, whatever Brian and his innovative institute have to say, I really think that you should all read it. So it starts with the very simple question that we see on the cover: what is education? And it's a question that sounds simple, but the contention of the book is that it's a question that is, in fact, a very difficult one to answer. And I think that the history of the book showed that for many of the contributors, this was certainly true. Why is it so difficult? The book also has an answer to this question. It suggests that it's difficult because education is largely missing from those very institutions that claim it as their function. So against what passes today for education, the book insists on the need to think again, beginning with this foundational question: what is education? But first, what is education not? Or rather, to ask the same question in a different way, what is this thing that today is called education? We're all probably familiar with the relentless marketisation and instrumentalisation of schools and universities, but I want to turn first to an example that I think really encapsulates some of the dynamics that this book views through the lens of what it terms the corruption of education. Aflatoun International is an NGO founded in Mumbai and based in the Netherlands that offers what it calls social and financial education to children and young people worldwide. I think they're linked up with Brian's organisation. According to its website, Aflatoun has a network of 192 partners and 26 governments, which enables the organisation to educate 4.5 million children each year in over 100 countries. Aflatoun International, it says of itself, creates high-quality curricula for different age groups, which can be contextualised to local needs or specific circumstances. That all sounds fine. It also trains teachers to deliver this curriculum around the globe. Now, Aflatoun's core program focuses on children of primary school age because, according to its own materials, new attitudes and behaviours are most easily absorbed during this time. As Jorge La Rosa writes in this book, education takes responsibility for childhood and for the world. Each child, he writes, following Hannah Arendt, is a new beginning. But this beginning, he argues, is betrayed if education simply assimilates children into a world that is predetermined, a world in which no new beginning is really possible. So what is the world that Aflatoun seeks to induct children into? I want to read something from their educational materials, which are for 10 to 14-year-olds. And this is from a lesson whose heading is My Future. So, that future again. Objectives. By the end of the lesson, the students will be able to A, understand that various professions require different sets of skills, education and commitment. B, be willing to take on different responsibilities to pursue their goals. Under the instructions to teachers, we read the following. Ask the students to imagine themselves at age 25 and write down what type of career they might want at that age. So we're imagining here astronauts, various other things. But then it goes on. Ask them to be ensured they include all of the following factors and elements: the level of responsibility involved in the work, the level of education required, the specific skills required to be successful in that career, the amount of risk involved in that type of work, e.g. health risks or job reliability, and I remind you that this is for 10-year-olds, the amount of time required per day or per week, the level of payment, low, medium, high, very high, the demand for the type of service or product the career provides, in brackets, market need. So here, 10-year-old children are asked to project themselves into that future and to imagine a future fully determined by the imperatives of the market, and to learn to subordinate themselves to what the curriculum materials call market need. Moreover, these children are asked to conceive their futures as always at risk, to accept that they will be forced to accustom themselves to health risks and to the threat of unemployment. More importantly, what they must learn is that in such a world, whether they succeed or fail is all their own individual responsibility. This is all starkly clear in another lesson about life goals, which again is directed at children as young as 10. But Aflatoun, I'll assure you, also has a program for preschool children, which are called Aflatots. So, life goals. By the end of this lesson, the students should be able to A, make a connection between responsibility and making good life choices. There's only an A in this one. And in this one, the teachers are directed to lead the students into a discussion and to use the following questions. Are there any experiences you have had of poor decision making? And then they're asked to ask some volunteers to share their experiences of poor decision making. Did you wish you had made a different decision or taken a different action? Why is it important to make good choices? How is responsibility a factor in making good life choices? How do your actions affect others? How do you assess or know the right thing to do? Then the teachers are asked to have the students form groups of between 5 and 7 students, and each group has to prepare either a skit or a song on the topic making good life choices. Now, obviously there's something almost comical about a pedagogy in which children, often in some of the world's most impoverished countries, engage in an education that consists in producing songs about making good life choices. But there's a deadly serious message. What these children must learn is that their future poverty will be entirely a result of their own failures to make good life choices. This is a lesson straight out of the neoliberal playbook. Responsibility, of course, was the key category of the neoliberal attack on the welfare state. The major neoliberal thinker Friedrich Hayek, for instance, stressed that a free society will not function unless, in his words, its members regard it as right that each individual occupy the position that results from his action and accept it as due to his action. Now, Hayek knows perfectly well, as I'm sure do the founders of Aflatoun, that our fates are not simply a product of our own individual choices. But the responsibilised neoliberal subject is meant to focus on changing the one thing we're told she can change, herself. Building one's own life, Hayek writes, is an unceasing task, a discipline that man must impose upon himself if he is to achieve his aims. Why not begin this training at 5 years old? Although Aflatoun's curriculum could have been taken from the pages of one of the many neoliberal thinkers of the 20th century, its name harks back to ancient Athens. Aflatoun, of course, is the Arabic name for the Greek philosopher Plato, and we've just heard about him. Aflatoun's founder chose this name, she said, because Plato espoused, in her words, an idealistic notion of citizenship that seemed to fit her organisation's mission. It is also from Plato that Adam Bartlett and Justin Clemens take the impetus for this book, though theirs, I'm sure you would imagine, is a very different Plato. In the book's introduction, they cite the following words from Plato's The Laws. Education should nowhere be despised, for when combined with great virtue, it is an asset of incalculable value. If it ever becomes corrupt but can be put right again, this is a lifelong task which everyone should undertake to the limit of his strength. For Plato, that corruption consisted in the transmission of a form of already constituted knowledge that served simply to reproduce existing social relations. Even worse, this corruption took the form of the assumption that this knowledge was all there was to know, that there can be no truth and no education but this one. Today, this form of corruption is widespread. Just this morning, I received an article in the email from the Chronicle of Higher Education that asked the panicked question, Do critical thinking skills give graduates the edge? Now, the background of this story was reports that certain employers, particularly in the United States, were moving away from educational scores, particularly at university, as markers of employability, and were instead setting their own tests. Now, the assumption of this article was that the purpose of higher education is simply to help graduates to get ahead in a competitive struggle for jobs, a Hobbesian war against all, or a true survival of the fittest. The article noted that university leaders generally describe what the article termed universities' added value as equipping students to think critically. The article's assumption, not really articulated, was that critical thinking should be judged from the perspective of whether or not it was valuable to an employer. Will critical thinking produce more productive employees, it asked. Or, in the terms of this book, will it reproduce rather than transform the dominant social relations, including relations of wage labour and exploitation? Now, the article warned that widespread doubt exists, presumably amongst employers, that critical thinking is the be-all and end-all of employability. I think anyone who's ever tried to get a job at McDonald's would probably not be that surprised to hear that. Now, it seems that businesses, in fact, don't necessarily want critical thinking. In fact, the article tells us that skills like pattern recognition are increasingly far more valued in the business world. But why should we assume that critical thinking exists only for the benefit of the employer? Or, in fact, that education does? What can't be thought here, the book would suggest, is another place for education, something other than producing good and docile employees. Now, there's a moment of doubt where this possibility of something else appears in this Chronicle article. Few would argue that universities should simply be factories for the production of trainee accountants, able to fit seamlessly into the corporate world, it says. Higher education is clearly about much more than that. But what is this much more? This is left completely unexamined, and in fact never returned to. In the terms of this book, that much more is what must constantly be obscured in order for education to take the form of the production of employability, job readiness, adaptation, flexibility, and resilience. It is this much more, the book tells us, that cannot be thought within the framework of the dominant educational practices and discourses. The question then is, can education produce anything genuinely new, anything capable of transforming rather than reproducing the dominant order? To suggest that today what counts as education is premised on the foreclosure of genuine transformation may seem odd, given the ubiquity of the language of innovation, reform, disruption, and even revolution, terms which Bartlett and Clemens notes are used as synonyms without any real interrogation of the differences between a disruption and a revolution, for instance. Yet it's through this very language of disruption and innovation that we're convinced that education will be nothing other than a research and development arm of a commercial world whose domination over curriculum and research is simply assumed. This very language serves to foreclose what Bartlett, in his chapter, calls real change, the upheaval in a world of the very logic that holds it together and provides its consistency. Just as the language of disruption and innovation serves to preserve the status quo, the equally ubiquitous language of flexibility, adaptability, and resilience leads to a foreclosure of individual and collective possibility. We saw this a couple of years ago at the University of Sydney, where in the context of enterprise bargaining negotiations, where the university was refusing any kind of job security for casual staff, a whole bunch of casualised academics did a protest out the front of the administration where they put on their yoga clothes and did a whole series of yoga moves under the slogan, "How flexible do you want us to be?" So for these casualised workers, flexibility meant simply bending over backwards in the hope of future work with no guarantees and no security. Meanwhile, for students, adaptability increasingly means training as a video game designer but being prepared to take a job at McDonald's, while resilience means putting up with this cheerfully. So the corruption then is clear. The instrumentalisation of education, what Sylvia Federici, writing about structural adjustment in Africa and its impact on education, calls dependent education. Education that's dependent on private money, on funders, on the imperatives of capital. It means enclosure, the privatisation of the university and the school, the enclosure of collectively produced knowledge for the benefit of capital. It means, finally, the foreclosure of truth, of ideas, of the possibility of something genuinely new. But this is not just a book about the corruption of education. We saw that for Plato, if education ever becomes corrupt but can be put right again, this is a lifelong task which everyone should undertake to the limit of his strength. This book affirms that it is not too late, that education can be put right, and therefore demands something of us. While I've dwelled on the corruption, the book is at least as valuable for its affirmation of another education, an education that is exceptional, that breaks with the reproduction of the status quo, an education that may take the form of alternative educational experiments that eschew tests and grades and begin from the axiom that we are all equal, and that aim, in Judith Bolso's words, to give to the one who does not know the future of thought. For all that it indicts the contemporary posture of what today is called education, this collection is in fact not a depressing one. Rather, its central message is the one that provides the title of Bartlett's chapter, Education Not Impossible. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a discussion, a panel discussion with Jess, the authors of the book, and I'm going to sit on the sidelines. But I'd just like to introduce our panelists once again to the stage. First of all, Jess, could I ask you to come up here? Again, Jess Whyte, everybody. Now, our authors and editors tonight, Dr. Justin Clemens is an associate professor in the Department of Cultural Communication. He's written extensively on philosophy and psychoanalysis, literature and art, slavery and love, on Milton, on cocaine, on contemporary poetry, on the crime of torture, on video games, mass media, technology, cybernetics, and politics. He's the author of Psychoanalysis is an Anti-Philosophy, and with John Roff and his frequent collaborator, Adam Bartlett, an unparalleled 12-handed philosophical sonata come nightmare opera called Lacan, Deleuze, Badiou. Justin is also the author of a number of collections of poetry, including the 20th century's only comic mock verse epic in rhyming couplets, the Mundiad, Sic Transit Gloria Mundi, as well as some truly stunning translations and poetic responses to the work of François Villon. I have said on a similar occasion that I consider Justin to be both the cynosure and the fons et origio of intellectual life in this depraved city. A figure whose profound erudition, scabrous wit, immense charm, and devastating intellect cannot help but inspire narcissistic rage and jealousy that he should spend time with anyone other than oneself. Please make him welcome. Dr. Adam Bartlett is the author of Badiou and Plato, An Education by Truths, a book that is so manifestly superior to every previous or subsequent work on Badiou, Plato, or education that the usual complacent milquetoast shibboleth-swapping liberal academe and its conservative excrescents have never been able to truly forgive him for showing up their relative and indeed absolute banality. Adam has written extraordinarily incisive, indeed brilliant studies of Marx, of St. Paul, Plato, and Lacan, but his greatest achievement has been the one-man war he has waged against educational nostrums that are at once so vacuous and so pervasive. I feel that one of the greatest indictments of our age is that Adam is less likely to be appointed as he should planetary cultural commissar as he is to suffer the fate of Socrates. He is the secretary of the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, a role to which he has brought the kind of integrity and devotion to the public good that Rousseau would have sworn died in the last days of the Roman Republic. Please make him welcome, Dr. Bartlett. Okay. members of the panel. I thought I'd start by just asking Adam and Justin to talk a little bit about the genesis and structure of this book, its aims, the meaning of the central provocation contained in the title, how you put the team together, and so forth.
Well, there's a few different traces or different types of genesis, I guess. There's the genesis of the question, and there's sort of the genesis of the book itself, which was an interesting educational story of its own. The question of what is education, I think both Jess and Bryan have given you a fairly good indication of why that question comes up. But in the most basic sense, it's because of the absolute ubiquity, particularly, I think, I'm not exactly sure when this begins in such a sort of a almost radical and vehement sense, but this sort of obsession around the question of education, maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years, I'm not too sure, where you started to hear all over the place conversations about education. Where will I send my kid? Is this school any good? People at the school gates having these discussions, the usual middle-class dinner party things as well, but also beyond that. And the constant refrain about we need to do this, we need to do that, there's money for this, there's money for that. Every election, of course, calls up the question of education. It was sort of this absolute ubiquity of discussions around education themselves. So an entire knowledge of this, seemingly, in terms of the way that people would say, no, I should send my kid there, or no, we need to be able to do that, or that's what they'll get out of that. So everyone seemed to know what it was, in and through its utility, I guess, and how you could fix a crisis in education, or if there was a crisis of some sort, then education was the answer to that. So it was really around that. And so obviously the clear and simple question, which is very Platonic, of course, in its originality. Socrates, no one liked him precisely because he did this thing where if everyone was talking about something, he would just simply go up and ask the stupid question, well, what is that thing you're talking about? I don't know anything about that. Can you tell me what that thing is? Right? And then they would, they would either, punch him out, or they would stick around and try and work it out through several different dialogues. So it was just, okay, well, there's all this going on. It's talked about all the time. Everyone seems to know what it is. So then just tell me what it is. And so that's where really the genesis of the question comes in. And of course, it has that philosophical or metaphysical aspect to it, because we want to precisely ask about this question such that we might get an answer, but not for a particular epoch or a particular time. And given education has been talked about for a long, long time in many different contexts, different ages, under different, ruling systems or, economies or whatever it might be, the Platonic sort of idea is there must be something essential to it. There must be something invariant to the name. And so the thing about that is if we can find or try to determine what's invariant to the name education, then it doesn't become reducible to any epoch or any determination or any, economic framework or whatever. Education will then be always that which escapes every determination which comes upon it. And of course it will be in every age, in every epoch, used and determined and said this is what it is and this is what will be done with it, and kids will be, this will happen to them and whatever. But if in the Platonic sense we can demonstrate what it actually is, then it can't be reduced to that in any way, shape or form. And for me, and for Justin and I talking about this, that's what we were trying to, well, hopefully, at least try to approach, or at least assume that possibility exists to answer that question, that education can be said to be that, so that it's not reducible to the temper of the times or whatever it might be. Yeah. So that's the sort of metaphysics, I guess, behind it. Yeah. The structure of the...
Yeah, I guess everything Adam says is, of course, correct. And one of the things about the question of education, aside from anything else, is that there cannot be a human society of any kind for which education is not absolutely at the centre of its concerns, whether formal, institutional, de facto, homeschooling, what have you. The question of education is uncircumventable, and it's absolutely paramount. It might be sexually differentiated, age differentiated. There's all sorts of ways, exactly as we know, and as everyone has experienced themselves. All of us are very, very well educated people in one form of another. But the problem is exactly as Adam says, for the last 20 years, and no doubt with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a whole load of geopolitical, environmental, and also technical inventions, something extraordinary has emerged, which makes the question of education, as both the CEO of the CII, and as Jess said, which was talking about, which makes the question of education absolutely paramount in every single institution at every single age, in which the question of education now is a question of agility, resilience, flexibility, adaptability. And what does that mean? It means that the problem of re-education is also at the centre of our world, i.e. you have to be continuously in a re-education camp, even if one kind or another. No institution can function without, because of the demands being issued from the global commercial sphere, that re-education camps are the very model, are the very centre of every single thing that we do, and there's no institution that escapes this, from that of childhood all the way up to old people's homes, where the question of university of the third age, for instance, or even in where education, you're either quick or dead, as the CII CEO recently related to us. And if you're going to be quick, you might be on the verge of death, but you'd better be fucking ready to be re-educated to squeeze the last scraps of jouissance from your decaying body. And even the corpses won't be safe, as Walter Benjamin says, when our enemies have won. And I guess that is the problem of the absolute intensity of and singularity of this question today, but one, exactly as Adam says, and has in fact taught me, that reopens the question of the absolute centrality and invariance of the question, what is education for today? Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, just in terms of the construction of the book too, which is, I guess, an interesting aspect of this, when we came up with the idea and the question, and we decided to put it out to tender, as it were, to ask people to write for us rather than to try to answer every bit itself. Yeah. We first aimed at what we would consider some of the most important thinkers on the planet right now, and so we wrote to these various figures, and most of them wrote back, and all of those who did expressed a profound interest in the project, and was a great idea, and so on, and many offered to write something for us. But then as time went on and discussions continued, it seemed that the very idea of addressing that question in this way became something which everyone's found very problematic. Yeah. To actually have to think about the thing which pretty much everyone does, who we would ask, of course, apart from being researchers or whatever, they're also teachers. So having to think about the very thing that you do in this sort of way seemed to be very challenging for everyone involved, no matter who we asked. Yeah. And so the book went through quite a lot of iterations, in fact. Even, like Jess was, of course, an early comrade of ours in this project, but even for her, it was like, I can't stick around for this. It's like, you guys are taking way too long. Everyone's abandoning us. I'm out of here. But, in spirit, she has remained with us, of course. But it became interesting for us that people who committed to this and thought it was a great idea couldn't actually ultimately sit down to think and write about this question. And
they became irritated, rude, absolutely abusive.
Yeah, we had a lot of abusive conversations. Yeah. Yes. We're abused by high-ranking American academics.
No. Jess has never been abusive. No. Bryan less so. But some very famous
people abused us via email.
Mainly Adam, for obvious reasons.
So
unprovoked, obviously.
Unprovoked. No, well, it was unprovoked. But going through the motions of we would like you to contribute to this volume. This is what we think we're doing. We think it would be interesting to you because your background work and so on. And just going through the to and fro of that, and eventually at a certain point, that they would either just go no, or with some people whose names I won't probably I don't know. What's the etiquette? Anyway,
I don't care. But
don't do it.
Okay.
Don't do it.
They became more antagonistic, and so we got into this strange battle. Me, no one, sitting in my little room with these people who I'm imagining, work in very prestigious sort of spaces, very famous, and they're getting more and more agitated and antagonistic towards not me, but the idea that we're trying to advance just to get out a little edited collection with a northern English. Well, Scottish press. But,
yeah, Scottish.
So that was a very interesting genesis. So, but finally, at a certain point, some people were committed and were committed to the project and put in the time and the effort and did what I think in every case in that collection did some really incredible and amazing work and tried to think through that question precisely without any other peripheral concerns or interests. So it was a very difficult collection to get up to this stage, and just even asking the question of all these people who've spent a lifetime doing this seemed to be provocative in a way we didn't expect. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you'll see, I mean, you've heard some things about the book already, but I guess is that there's a kind of, despite the very difference, the contributors, very different thinkers from very different parts of the world writing about very, very different phenomena, a certain consistency or coalescence of the situation we're in sort of starts to become apparent. There's obviously the ideological stuff that all of us say, neoliberalism's bad. There's some bad things, right?
Lots of bad things.
Yeah, the things that Bryan was saying, they're obviously bad things, and we all agree they're bad things because we're all educators and we hate neoliberalism and so forth. So there's that ideological moment throughout the book, but there's nothing we can do about it. However, there's also analytic moments in the book in which it's become clear in the preface which Alain Badiou sent to us really makes this clear. We're at the limits of the forms of education that have been bequeathed us since the French Revolution. And it's worth mentioning that universal schooling, I can recommend an image by a Scottish artist, again, called Chad McHale, which basically, I don't know if you know this guy, does these fantastic sort of cartoon images, and he has this very great image in like a kind of cartoon panel sequence, which starts off, the Prussians are humiliated by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena, so 1805, 1806. The Prussians swear revenge. The Prussians introduce universal schooling precisely because they know that they lost to Napoleon because of education, and they established 3 types of compulsory schooling for children. One, as Mikhail says, most children are learned to take orders, to obey them, a particular kind of school. Some people fewer learn to transmit orders, and I guess that's the educators, ourselves, and then a few learn to issue commands. And as Mikhail says, progress is made. Of course, the Prussians then humiliate the French. They go on to humiliate pretty much everyone else in Europe. And as Mikhail says, the lesson is clear. After 1870, in particular through the 1860s and 1870s, on the basis of the Prussian military victories, universal schooling introduced for children across Europe. That's the first moment that returns in the book, the industrialised militarisation of schooling and education for all of us, a state education after the French Revolution. The second moment, apparently a counter moment, which is the radical sociological questioning of all of the verities of this positivist militarised education. No, these apparently universal canons are in fact colonial and iniquitous, that we need specificity in education, locality. We need individuals and identities to affirm themselves against this. This is a great moment of critique, but it's also a moment that leads precisely to the neoliberal moment insofar as it dissolves any form of universalism other than the pure and empty form of the neoliberal subject, which I think I just described like incredibly well before. And so here we are, like a kind of archaeology, the ruins of this triple education system, militarised industrialism of a state education for all, the criticism of the state education on the lines of decolonisation, and then the third moment, neoliberalism. And it turns out that all of these moments now, today, work very, very well together. And this is one of the moments I think that occurs in the book. But the third moment, and maybe the least depressing moment, or maybe the most depressing moment, is the attempt that many of the contributors have to try and create on the basis of this horrific archaeological destruction, I guess, or deconstruction, a new idea that is linked to the ancient invariant of the question of education. And I think they're the kind of the third moment of the book. One, the ideological, we hate neoliberalism. Secondly, the analytic, which gives a kind of reconstruction of this history, which is not really the history that we often expect, or the one that's often promulgated as in the histories of education themselves. And then thirdly, a moment of reconstruction according to the problematic of truth and of the idea which all of us, exactly as Plato says, in the Laws, in the moment that Bryan quoted, if education is corrupt, who should not spend their life trying to set this question right again, turn the world upside down? So.
Fantastic. I'd like to ask you some more questions about the philosophical content of the book, but I'd also like to invite Jess, given our seating arrangements are designed to have a kind of pincer movement on these two guys. Thinking, for example, of something that you both said in your initial responses, I'd like to ask you a question about redundancy. And the question goes like this. You've both mentioned that, in a sense, education goes on continually in a number of contexts, right? We used to make a distinction between formal education and civic education. There's an ambiguity attendant to civic education, whether it's education for or by the city. But you have a situation where, on the one hand, as came out in Jess's presentation, you have formal education designed to be education for the world of the market. But everything in the world educates for the market. And so that should make formal education redundant, right? As in, because everything, including the old people's homes and so forth, the television and media and so forth, contributes to that education. And yet instead you have this sort of hypertrophy. Formal education needs to more and more work towards making people ready for the market. Billions of dollars spent on education, constant reports about the crisis of education and so forth. Could you perhaps both, and including Jeff, speak to that, I suppose, paradox?
I think, in terms of what you're suggesting is that, and I guess what we're trying to also aim at is that the idea of education continues to insist, and that's what we're trying, the book's trying to highlight in some ways. And I think that the insistence of that idea is also marked in the various attempts, and I guess in our particular epoch, the neoliberal sort of envelopment of everything. It's still necessarily, in order to get across what it wants to get across, needs to invoke that sort of idea of education, which continues to insist, and which people recognise, perhaps even despite or against the sort of, constant sort of refrain that comes across through neoliberalism and through the institutions which now pretty much, follow its prescriptions in what they do. There's still an attachment to the idea in some sense. And in fact, to get away with what the project of turning education into what it is that they say it is, they still need to be, in a way, predatory upon that idea. So weirdly, by being predatory upon the idea, by simply really exploiting the idea, I guess, they actually keep the idea alive. Even if constantly they must make sure that the idea itself does not escape their determination, the idea still insists, and the idea is still very powerful. We still call the university, in the other sense, the academy. Right, we're referencing right back to Plato. The academy is just the name for a bit of land he bought from his uncle to start this school outside the city. The Grove of Hecademus, right? He was a sporting hero, for Christ's sake. He's probably very Australian.
It's very Melbourne.
Very Melbourne. But it becomes named the academy, and the academy becomes this thing. But it's still a frame of reference, and they still like to use the term academy. I'd like to speak of all what we consider the virtues, I guess, of education, yet they're necessary in order to perpetrate, the crimes against education, which we know go on when education itself becomes, secondary to the real task of these institutions. So it's a strange paradox in that regard.
Exactly what Adam says. The problem with corruption is that an idea is corrupt, but as you corrupt it, you're still corrupting the idea which insists as a result. But then, since you know this, and this is something that both Jess and Bryan picked up on, the problem for the neoliberal subject is that it has to be educated to know that it can't know what the future is. And what the future is a kind of injunction to constantly adapt to the demands of the future which we don't know what it is. And so the education today, or the constant re-education, must also be a constant education in re-educability, in your own necessary re-educability if you're going to continue to live, which means to continue to be in a situation of re-education. So this kind of utter collapse of commercial futurity into the present, where the only reason to keep on living is to keep on being able to be re-educated in order that the idea which we need in order to keep on going never actually breaks free of the capture of a re-education in this way, i.e. whatever you learn must be able to be discarded. You cannot stick to it, it cannot stick to you, it must come, but it must go. And so that the partisans of the flux, these partisans of re-educability, which I think is part of this neoliberal, the futurity of the commercial injunction entering the present as risk, and therefore a kind of constant smashing of individuals into this individual re-educability is part of its program.
Jess?
Yeah, I think another thing that we see is a transformation of something that Bourdieu talked about long ago, the idea of education as a marker of distinction. And one of the things that really struck me in the book is a quote in, I think it's Jorge Larosa's piece, where he talks about children at a school in Spain who were asked to write down, "I am not a cost, I am an investment," and each with their name. And I think that this language of the investment in human capital is something that has absolutely transformed this idea of what it means to think of education as a marker of distinction. So you think of, for instance, Foucault's lectures on Gary Becker, in particular, the American human capital theorist, where Foucault notes that suddenly everything becomes a matter of investment in human capital, that education is an investment in human capital, that everything that we do, migration choices, all become about this sort of matter of investing in oneself in order to get ahead. And I think that there's a real anxiety that is involved in this. And one of the things that's central to this idea of investment in human capital is that not everyone is equally worthy of investment.
Yep.
And we see this language constantly, even in reports on Australian Research Council grants, where people talk about people as being good investments. And obviously not everyone is a good investment. So the logic that declares some to be good investments is also the logic that says that some people are not worth investing in, that they're disposable or should be disposed of. So I think that this creates a permanent anxiety, and it's a genuine anxiety about the future. I don't want to dismiss people's anxiety about employability and what the future holds for people, but I think that that means that while in a certain sense education becomes redundant, on the other hand it becomes more necessary than ever, because unless you're constantly investing in your human capital, whether through a university education or an unpaid internship, then you run the risk of slipping down that ladder and being considered not a good investment, so therefore being sacrificed, disposed of.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that leads to your ambivalent position on what, Justin, you were characterizing as the second moment of the critical sociological moment that you find in the works of Bourdieu. That on the one hand, you accept the nature of these critiques against the positivist model and acknowledge the importance of their contextualization of the role of education in social reproduction and imperial adventures and so forth. But at the same time, you talk about the way this critique has been used to evacuate the possibility of an idea of education that is different from that of the neoliberal, that even though it's critical of the market model, it ends up saying, well, all that education is this reproduction, and then the neoliberal moment goes, yes, it is. Actually, that's the goal. We deal with investors and so forth.
One of the key, I think the key metaphysics of the neoliberal position is this notion, well, it has a knowledge of what can't be known. That's sort of the way we try to frame it, and people in the book speak about it in this way, is the market itself is described as this entity into which all sort of information and stuff enters, and it itself sort of determines what then becomes knowledge for the way that everyone in the social world has, relates to it. There's nothing that humans can do, or we haven't got the capacity to actually think our situation as such. So the market acts as this sort of thing through which all information goes, and out comes the sort of knowledge by which we live. I mean, this idea of the knowledge economy, which sort of becomes, I guess, predominant and discussed from the late 80s onwards, as if knowledge itself becomes an economy, or becomes more truly subject to the form of economy that we have. And so the sort of weird paradigmatic framework that we have is that there is a knowledge that exists of what we cannot know. And in a way that sort of belongs to a longer metaphysical tradition, but in our context, thinking about knowledge and the possibilities of education, or what escapes this form of determination of education, it means that you're sort of weirdly hamstrung, or sort of a double bind, because the whole prescription to which education itself has now submitted itself is that we predicate what we can know on the fact that there is this unknowability. So there's this whole space which completely off limits to thought and to thinking, and therefore to education. So education itself becomes constrained and hamstrung, the very notion, the very idea, the very term. Yet constantly, of course, education always speaks to the possibility of something else, which is why, again, it must be utilised in a particular way, because it's always speaking to change and innovation and so on. But the one thing that can't be changed is the framework in which change can be talked about or determined, right? I mean, they love innovation, as everyone's noted. It's always there. It's in every policy document. It's in every description of every course. It's everywhere. But the one thing that can't be innovated is innovation itself, right? It's the end of innovation is innovation, which is sort of weird, It's like, and what is the knowledge then which determines the limits for us? Where does that come from? Why can't we have access to that if we're interested in education? Who gets, what is this knowledge that we cannot know? That's sort of the strange double bind that we're in terms of thinking about these things.
I was really struck by some of Jess's work on neoliberalism, which is what she's been doing. And when she was talking about it the other day, it became particularly around Hayek, obviously one of the great progenitors of contemporary neoliberalism, was exactly what Adam is saying is where it is forbidden to say, we have to be taught to know that it's forbidden to know what the market is, because anyone who claims that they know what the market is clearly a fantasist, false, and so because no one can know, we must be taught that we must not know, and we must not know what the market is, and we must not think we can know what the market is, and that has to be taught as part of education in order for the reproduction of, there will be nothing outside this incredibly restricted part of education. And so education now takes on a tenor of being an absolute education in ignorance, like an absolutely enforced ignorance as part of its, what you cannot know is the sorts of things that we're, for example, the distribution of the market, certain, we're not allowed to have access to certain forms of commercial confidence in even public investment and so on and so forth. And this withdrawal of everything from the world of knowledge, the instrumentalising of an enforced withdrawal is part of the education system today, an integral part of it, I think.
I think that's right. I mean, it's very curious thinking about this neoliberal moment, and particularly Hayek's thought, because he's renowned as the person who talked about the market as an information processor and made the argument that social planning of any kind was simply impossible because it was necessarily going to be inferior to the market in enabling the circulation of dispersed information. So this idea seems to be a very sort of liberatory or emancipatory one, that there's all this knowledge dispersed through the society and that the market will convey it from one person to another without any need for a sort of dictatorial form of imposition of a single knowledge. But actually, if you look closely at Hayek's work, in fact, what he's arguing is not that the market conveys knowledge, but that the market enables us to live in the absence of knowledge, in conditions of radical ignorance. Because in fact, what we get from the market, or from really what is talking about the price mechanism, is simply a price. And the price is not knowledge, the price is a surrogate for knowledge. So what the price is a surrogate for is, for instance, the costs of production of a commodity, how much the workers were paid, all of these kinds of questions. But what we're told is that we don't need to know these things. In fact, that we should be ignorant of them, but that our actions will be shaped. And he uses explicitly the language of we will be governed by prices, we will be disciplined by prices. So in fact, rather than attempting to understand our society, to know it, we're told that we just need this impersonal mechanism of a price system which will enable us to act without knowledge. And I think that what's really dangerous about it is this is not just ideology in the sort of, the blunt sense of the term of just things that aren't really true. But in fact, this becomes a reality. So if you look at universities, for instance, the uncapping of student numbers and the fact that universities can now take as many students as apply and as they choose to let in, means that universities are actually completely subjected to market fluctuations. So it actually genuinely becomes impossible to plan, because you never know, particularly at a university like mine where we have very, very large student numbers in courses, you don't know whether you're going to have 2,500 students or whether you're going to have 1,800 students. And that makes an enormous difference, obviously, for staffing, for resources, for what subjects you run. So this is not just a set of ideas, this is actually something that becomes the reality that we live in.
I have many further questions to ask you, but I think we were saying before, with time going, it might be time to open the floor to the audience to ask questions of our panelists. Jose, can we have the lights back on? And James and Matt, would you mind helping Jose with our roving mic? We can all help point to people who put their hands up to ask you guys things.
I really always think about Andy Warhol and the problem when people like us are talking of leave them wanting less. And look, I feel that we're doing that very effectively, like at the moment. Like.
Yeah, I disagree. Like,
excellent.
Excess breeds the desire for more things. Clearly,
I guess that's right. I'm sorry, I stand corrected.
Is there any questions out there? We're trying to get at. Is there any questions out there?
Sorry, I can't see the audience very well.
No.
Jose, can we? Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay, James and Matt are doing their thing. Excellent.
Oh my God.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Hello.
I think there's someone at the back.
No,
she's
yeah. That's
no.
Vetoing that person. Sorry. Anybody? Questions? Questions for
anything at all?
No. All right, John Rubin. John Rubin, thank you.
Yeah, it's a question really about Plato. Really it's more a question about Socrates. Because I'm thinking about texts like the Alcibiades, where Socrates basically wants to argue that you've got to take care of yourself in this constant monitoring of yourself in order to actually live a life worth living. And the trouble is once you take that on board, you can see how that kind of attitude gets taken up again in kind of more contemporary discourse, precisely in that, well, actually, yes, Socrates is right, but what you've got to do now is, rather than trying to educate yourself to be a better person, you educate yourself to be a more employable person. And the worry is can you really differentiate between a sense of education that isn't simply training, but because you can see the roots of this constant self-improvement are there in the Greeks, and are there in Socrates' injunction to Alcibiades. My worry now is that education may only be training now.
Yeah,
It's a good question.
yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. In the just to go sideways a little bit, in the quote that both Bryan and Jess read out, that we sort of have as like an orienting maxim in the book a little bit, you know, if it ever becomes corrupt, etc., you know, that comes about when they discuss that distinction that you're sort of alluding to, John, between training and education. And they say that a training up in, you know, the various things that you need to be trained up for in order to exist and prosper in the city and so on, has to be at some point distinguished from what they mean by education, which has to include essentially a training up in virtue, which really means a training up in knowing what it is that's good about those very things you've been trained up in. So it's that extra step. It's not just a matter of being trained up into something so that you can perform a task. You have to know what the good of that task is and how that fits into a larger picture, in their case, of the city, for example. So all of the discussions that Socrates has with everybody, I mean, with Alcibiades, it's always a little bit different because they have this particular relationship, the two of them, you know, and it sort of fluctuates around various things. And, you know, Alcibiades is a bit of a, you know, he's the possibly best student Socrates ever had if only he'd done what he was supposed to do rather than taking that great talent off and doing all the other things that Alcibiades did, which were, you know, very interesting and exciting, but nevertheless were also an abuse of what the possibilities that he had. But so all the discussions themselves are precisely oriented often around this question because, you know, as you know, Socrates goes to the people who know how to do things or profess to know how to do things or seem to know how to do things and wants to precisely ask the question, you know, about what it is that you are doing, not just how you do it and show me the techniques, but do you know if there is or what it is that you're doing insofar as it you know, serves or belongs to some notion of the good. And the good, generally speaking, is what is good for all. They're trying to, you know, they're discussing it in that sort of context. So they do make the distinction, and I think that distinction is still very important. There's no doubt we need to be trained up into various roles, and people desire to do that. There's nothing at all wrong with that. But when that training up, as you say, is the only thing that there is, then we have no idea and no reason to know why it is we're doing this thing or what the good of that thing precisely is. And I think in a way that's where what we're talking about in our own time, which does mirror in some respects the conversations that went on, you know, or that Plato, you know, relates to us in the dialogues, is we have this problem that we've essentially have submitted what we understand education to be a training up in what we need to know to exist and to prosper within the city as it is. So essentially in terms of reproduction. But the question is, well, what is the good of what it is that we know how to do? That's the further question, and that distinction still inheres and exists, and precisely, I guess, the thing about different epochs or ages is that we need to find what that good is today, now, under this situation. So that's what I'd say about the possibility of that distinction.
Just quickly, John, if I remember correctly, and that one of the things that happens in that dialogue in the Alcibiades Major is Socrates says, Alcibiades, you're young, you're beautiful, you're rich, everyone wants to sleep with you, and you want to go and govern the city, and you're well placed to do this, you're well trained to do this, but you don't even know what the city is, what it means, what the city is, and what it means to be a citizen. And I would point, but Adam, you're better to speak on this than me. That the sort of I think the Platonic question is always to go beyond education for the needs of the city to the question of something that is both universal and singular. One of the things these guys do in the book that's also adumbrated, well, explicit in earlier works by Adam is emphasize the fact that Socrates in the dialogues is often positioned as the one person who does not educate, right? Who educates the city of Athens? Everybody in the city of Athens. That's the apology. Meaning everybody except Socrates. But the optimistic moment that we didn't get to, but that Jess mentioned of their book, is precisely about taking the inexistent, right? The only thing that doesn't educate as a model for the universal singular, for something that is unknown in terms of the logics that dominate the city. But you can say more. You'll obviously know more about that than me.
But even in the terms that you and that everyone's you and Jess have offered, is what does you know, education. We all, as Jess said before, you know, it's not just a couple of ideas or ideologies floating around in terms of neoliberalism, but hardcore institutional revisions and around, you know, take off the cap of student numbers. It's not just one move among others. It's extremely careful, targeted move in order to ensure the transmission of an irremediable form of ignorance. And what exactly, as Bryan has just reminded us, that everyone in us, the city, all of us continuously are giving each other that education in neoliberalism. We ourselves, the transmitters and bearers of it, we act it out every day in all of our little meetings, the way that I answer emails by apologising, I wish I'm sorry I have not answered your email. All of these weird little gestures of neoliberal life are themselves transmitters and reproducers of the law of the destruction of the city that is the neoliberal law. One of the things that Socrates does, and this is in, I think to spruik Adam's first book, which is also on sale at the back on your way out, in which he emphasises around the character of Socrates, is that, you can be wandering around the agora, you could be at a friend's house drinking or not drinking, you can, no matter what situation you're in, Socrates is interrupting or disrupting, as we like to say today, the smooth transmission of educability in the reproduction of the city by being annoying, irritating, claiming he knows nothing. In fact, the only person who's not educating is in fact this figure who stops, interrupts, somehow forces people to start to give an account of themselves that otherwise they wouldn't do. And it's not a training and it's not a self-monitoring, because they're not just asking about themselves, they're asking about something that is precisely not anyone or anything in the city itself, even though the city itself must be founded upon precisely that factor. So the thing that's all presumed but nowhere apparent, and in fact is made inapparent by the very city that requires this kind of extimate kernel, whether it's truth, the idea, justice, however you want to put it. And that's part of the education that Socrates gives. It's precisely not an education after that pattern.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting in the book, in all the different contributors who are very different, there's a sort of semi-empirical studies of Bangladesh, there's African development and so on, there's a fantastically strange dialogue by Alessandro Rousseau, a great Italian sociologist, the brilliant depiction of the figure of the ogre throughout Jorge La Rosa's one, Judith Balso speaking about some contemporary French experiments and so on, and Keith Ansel Pearson speaking about Bergson and what Bergson's talking about. Each of them are actually independent of each other and completely disparate and not under any sort of tutelage, but they all aim in each of the essays to find that point of inexistence or that point of anomaly, which the very situation that we're in nevertheless can't help but produce in some fashion, right? The very thing we can't know, the very thing which is meant to inexist, the very thing that must not be. Each of the writers in their various ways and with various different influences are actually trying or aiming at first determining the existence of such a thing and then trying to write from that position. So very much like Socrates, who is the most anomalous figure, the only figure in the whole entire Athens who doesn't educate. They say that in the Apology. So he's this singular, strange figure that hangs around Athens in all these dialogues, precisely, as an inexistence, which actually makes it possible for something new to be thought within that context and within that framework of education.
Yeah, and let's not forget the ugliest man in Athens as
all
well.
Those things. I mean, he's
physically repulsive.
Abnormal in all sorts of ways. That's right, exactly. He doesn't have a job either, which is great.
Jesus.
He doesn't like to have. He has one shower, I think, in the entirety of the dialogues.
Yeah.
But he incites desire, and that's something else that the book mentions in terms of our times. That on the one hand, there's this completely, and just as rightly pointed out, not simply ideologically neoliberal, but fundamentally, structurally, materially, transformatively neoliberal. And yet, one of the things that continues to escape that, we need education to solve the problem of the future, as again says, because all that is just mentioned, all that is solid melts into air, and people are really in precarious situations. Education offers this kind of ballast in the face of this precarity. But while all of that's true, one of the other things that makes education something that people seek out is something like desire in a Lacanian sense, as opposed to demand, and that's what I hear in this language of insistence, not the kind of we need this because we need to do these things. Socrates is annoying. The sophist offers training. He actually offers us nothing, and he's really, really deeply unsexy, but even Alcibiades, the Byronic hero who everyone wants to sleep with, is attracted to him, right? Because there's something there, something that insists, even though it can't be named in terms of the knowledge of the situation. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, sorry to...
Oh, hey, Brendan.
I recognised rats. Sorry to jump into the future, but do you have another publication in mind, or is there another book coming? And
on this topic, or?
Well, I was thinking about what is spontaneity?
Okay.
All right. Well, you can propose us the project, and I'm not sure I'm going to do that, but it's not a bad idea. Yeah.
Oh, just even the idea of spontaneity itself, which now often means like freedom, arbitrary, whimsical, or willful freedom. Spontaneity, I think in a lot of the German idealists, particularly after Kant, spontaneity is a kind of what is it? It's something that emerges from the between the outside and the inside. It's like a concept that arises on at the very borderline between the conscious and the unconscious. Spontaneity isn't free; it's utterly determined in some ways. Spontaneity is a name that we give to this what do you call it? This little thing. You think, whew, yeah, no, something. Yeah.
Is it linked to enthusiasm in that context?
I think it can sometimes be linked to enthusiasm, but yeah.
Well, there is that.
That was his spontaneous answer.
That does remind me that you didn't, like in going through the chapter list, mention, I won't say the best chapter, but the chapter about Hegel by Mladen Dolar, and it does occur to me that one of the things that the book...
It's called the Master and Professor are Dead, and I'm not feeling so well myself. Yeah.
Genius title, obviously.
It's a great title.
But that some of this language, like things like spontaneity, like invariably falls into the adaptability, flexibility, creativity, hooray. And I suppose that's something that I wanted to maybe ask you to respond, sort of taking up Brendan's question, that on the one hand, the book in its ideology critique phase disdains and mocks that kind of language for good reason. And yet, it doesn't do so absolutely, because there is a question about real change, right, and real creation and actual novelty. And how does one distinguish actual novelty in an age where novelty is constantly being invoked to describe everything? And that seems to be one of the fundamental stakes of the book.
Yeah.
Matt?
Someone got a question? Yeah?
Oh, yeah, please. Sorry, I saw you waving at me, but not the person who wanted to ask a question, sorry.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Cooke.
Bonsoir. Mademoiselle.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Bartlett et Monsieur Clemens and Miss Whyte. Bonsoir. I have a very specific question to ask. Alain Badiou, he said in one of his books, which is Le Fini et l'Infini, page 27.
Very specific. Yeah.
He said, étudier, ça veut dire, y compris étudier l'infini et le fini. That means education has to take into account both the finite and the infinite. My question for you is one that torments me as a physicist and mathematician. My question for you is, how can we, as finite beings, teach the thinking of the infinite?
Such a great question. Yeah, let's do it, people. Adam, you obviously have to go
clearly
first on
know
this.
the answer if you're so excited by the question. It's a fantastic question, and that's why I have. I have to go. I have to think.
I'm excited because I don't know the answer to the question.
Right.
Now, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I would
Do you want to
say,
tackle that?
I'll say no. I want to answer it by not answering it at all, by adverting once again to Jess's point around what does a neoliberal education insist on? It insists that we must be unlimited, not infinite, because there must be. There's no. If you were infinite, there would be no point to you being educated or re-educated. But you have to be unlimited, i.e., you're constantly limited in order to be told that you must not be stuck with the limitations that you've been given. And so it's a dialectic, I would say, in neoliberal education, as a kind of parasitic dialectic on top of the problematic of the finite and the infinite, of the limited and the unlimited, which is its kind of reuptake and capture by neoliberalism, which is very, very close to, in fact, trying to tell us where the locus of the finite and the infinite. In the account that, if we're going to go back to Plato and Socrates, which I think Badiou does, there's something about the temporality and the relationship to reminiscence in Plato. The infinite is already here and already with us. It's only our finitude that has not enabled us to see it. And what education will do is perhaps through the slave boy in the Mano, or in the great parables that conclude the Republic. The point of education is to also bring people to the point to realise we're neither limited nor unlimited. We are finite, but only because we always already live in the infinite. And I think there would be some other great metaphysical philosophers, whether it's Descartes or Spinoza, Hegel, Kant, in very, very many different ways, that the infinite is with us already, even if it goes under different names. And the problematic of the reinvention of education in its invariance is to precisely tap that gap which you've brought out.
Justin, I don't know what your problem is with the unlimited. My university's motto is unlimited.
Just
unlimited.
But of course,
unlimited.
I was going to take up part of Justin's answer and say that the identification of the infinite with the unlimited is the original Greek notion of apeiron, where the apeiron cannot exist except, as Aristotle says, as mere potentiality, is associated with mess, is associated with chaos. And I think it's interesting that, as both Jess and Justin have brought out, that our current education discourse, on the one hand, stresses that we must be unlimited, and at the same time is obsessed with finitude, right? As Badiou would say, the dominant ideology that there are only bodies and languages. Each of us are potentially vulnerable, suffering human beings, and we're constrained by culture, et cetera, et cetera. So you simultaneously go, educational discourse simultaneously says you're finite, you're vulnerable, radically limited by culture, but at the same time, unlimited. Yeah. Like, come to the University of Jess's university, I won't say that. Come to Jess's university and learn how to be unlimited. But when Badiou's talking about the infinite, he's talking about something different. He's saying, on the one hand, yes, finite, bodies, animals, all that, it's true, doesn't believe in an immortal soul, but I think associates infinity with, on the one hand, being, is a post-Kantorian conception of infinity, but also with truths. The truth as process is not bound to the situation. Finitude is an effect of the infinite, and I think is a kind of I was going to say gentrification of the infinite. It's a bollocks, a self-limitation of the infinite, which makes it sound a bit too Hegelian. But I think that the line that Badiou most likes in Hegel is Hegel insisting in the logic that when he says, if the infinite is opposed to the finite, right, then it's not properly infinite, because it would be limited by the finite and so forth. And I think Badiou thinks that's not quite right. It's still a pre-Kantorian conception of infinity, but it's a step on the right direction, away from that Greek sense of the apeiron versus
At the very
paras.
least, there's two infinities already in Hegel, which already radicalizes and transforms that position.
Yeah,
but
badly.
furthermore, there's also worth saying for Badiou that the infinite is utter banality. Like it's already here, it's already with us, it's mere, we're already infinite. The problem is the production of the finite, and even as a subject, even as finite subjects ourselves, it's the production of real finitude that's at stake for us. And what does that mean? That's to link to an infinite process that actually produces something new in the already existing sphere of infinity. So to be both finite and, we're already infinite. It's the finitude that needs to be achieved, like proper finitude, not simple limitation, not anthropological limitation.
And I guess that's where the idea of education comes back in, because every education is directed towards the creation of subjects. Some subject, right? So a subject of the present configuration, or in this sense, talking about this finite thing, a procedure which is already within that conception of the infinite, but to produce a new present here and now, that's the sort of procedure which this sort of idea of education determines to enact. So precisely to produce that something here and now, a new type of present, which doesn't yet exist, but precisely because we know that it's possible to make such a thing, because we're not bound precisely by this notion of the unlimited, which is essentially an idea of the infinite, which is bounded by this idea of potential. And that's sort of what this sort of idea of the infinite is there. And you're right, the Greek sense is not the same thing, but Socrates actually keeps on marking that point.
Yes.
But, where the infinite somehow adheres within the finite situation that he's always in. And you're right, the idea of reminiscence or recollection in the Meno is in some way trying to I guess, explicate that, but without the means or the tools to do it. But it's approaching that sort of notion that somehow we are creatures of the infinite already, and in here and now we must produce out of that something which is present for us. And I guess, It's a subjective aspect, though. Education produces subjects. That's always its aim.
Where subject doesn't mean individual.
No, that's right.
Okay, we have contracted with the Wheeler Centre to get out of here at 9 o'clock. So thank you very much for your indulgence and patience. Please thank our three wonderful panelists one last time. Thank you.
That's great.
Now, go out into the night and be consumed by fire.